Robert Strayer, PhD in European and African History, has taught at the State University of New York, Brockport, the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, the University of California, Santa Cruz, California State University, Monterey Bay, and Cabrillo College. He has received awards for excellence in both teaching and scholarship. His published works include books on African, Soviet, and world history. He is the lead author of Ways of the World, a brief global history widely used in college and AP courses. For those of you who know those signifiers, you grok something of what Bob has been up to. But recently, the quest has been to speak of tonight's topic, musing on history and Jung.
Thank you, John.
You take it.
And I have to thank John for more than inviting me here, because John read an earlier version of this talk and gave me very helpful suggestions, both stylistic. John is an editor and finds it difficult to restrain himself from editing, but also substantive suggestions as well. And another thank you goes to Jeff Keel. Jeff read and commented on an earlier draft of this paper, and more to the point, Jeff supplied me with a 15-page, single-spaced, double-sided set of quotations from Carl Jung on history, which saved me from reading the collected works, you see. So,
hooray for Jeff!
So I'm most grateful to John and to Jeff. Jung and I have something in common. Jung acknowledges that he is an amateur historian, and I want to acknowledge that I am a very amateur Jungian. So I hope you will take that into account. So among many other roles, Jung operated as a historian. He modestly acknowledged that he was an amateur historian, and that while his work had a certain historical character, it was different from that of academic or professional historians. And that is the tension I'd like to explore with you tonight. How did Jung approach or make use of history? And in what ways did Jung's historical inquiries both parallel and diverge from that of more conventional historians? Next slide.
Oh, let's keep the slides.
Now, Jung makes a fundamental distinction between two kinds of history. On the one hand, there is what he calls objective history. It is the history which we make, or more evocatively, the spirit of the times. It is the product of the rational mind, and it deals with wars and conquests and empires and social change and religions and the like. Here, he is describing what most professional historians do and what most people consider history to be. But on the other hand, Jung also refers to what he calls natural history, or perhaps archetypal history, or more evocatively, the spirit of the depths. This kind of history resides a priori in the collective unconscious, and it is dormant until it is activated and then manifested in conscious life. It contains the unwritten history of mankind from time unrecorded, expressed in myth and symbol. Now, Jung is clear about the relative significance of these two kinds of history. The great events of world history, objective history, he declared, are at bottom profoundly unimportant. They are only the leaves and blossoms on the stem of the eternal tree. They are, the more authentic history, however, is hidden in the rhizome and occurs in the unconscious, deeply buried, Hi. It is deeply buried, experienced by all, and observed by none. The events of history are but the superficial symptoms of these psychic happenings. Now, slide 3. Here we encounter some ambiguity in Jung's understanding of historical agency in the making of history. He repeatedly makes the case that individuals are at the center of history. In the last analysis he wrote in 1933, the essential thing is the life of the individual. This alone makes history. Here alone do the great transformations take place. We make our own epic. But are individuals acting as free agents who might have decided to do otherwise? Or are they rather conduits for psyche, particularly its unconscious dimensions, understood as a more or less autonomous actor? He writes, our psyche is responsible for all historical changes wrought by the hand of man on this planet. But then, in the face of this apparent contradiction, do individuals make history or does psyche make history? Jung writes this, which seems to me to be a wonderful and wise caveat. The psyche remains an insoluble puzzle, an incomprehensible wonder, an object of abiding perplexity. Indeed, so the mystery of agency persists in Jung's thinking. Now, in what specific ways did Jung engage with history? In some respects, he understood history viewed as traditions that are deeply rooted in the past. He viewed this as a burden and an obstacle, a barrier actually, to personal growth. Slide 4 now. Writing about women in Europe after World War I, Jung argued that those women who challenged long-established patriarchal traditions found themselves up against what Jung called the full weight of historical inertia. This slide shows one woman who illustrates that weight of historical inertia. This is Emily Davison, a 40-year-old British suffragette who in 1913, at a major race in Great Britain, threw herself in front of the king's horse bearing suffragette slogans and was trampled to death. This is Emily Davison. She certainly came up against the full weight of historical inertia. More generally, Jung implied that history and outdated traditions stifled progress and individuation. And what this means in practice is that those who want to make history must become unhistorical. That is, they had to, and these are Jung's terms, they had to tear themselves loose from that all-embracing pristine unconsciousness which claims the bulk of mankind almost entirely. More generally, however, Jung engaged with history, both objective history and archetypal history, in more positive ways, although it's actually not always so easy to tell which he is referring to. But history was essential to Jung's thinking because to him, the psyche contains a deposit of all human experience right back to its remotest beginnings. We are very far, he wrote, from having finished completely with the Middle Ages, classical antiquity, and primitivity, as our modern psyches pretend. Jung's famous house dream, which contributed to his break with Freud, illustrates this historical character of archetypal images. In that dream, he begins on an upper floor that is decorated in an 18th century Rococo style. He moves down to the ground floor, whose furnishings were medieval, and then down further to the cellar, which evoked Roman times, and even deeper into a cave that suggested primitive prehistoric eras. To Jung, the dream revealed what he called a history of successive layers of consciousness, a kind of structural diagram of the human psyche. Slide 5. This is another of Jung's schematic portrayals of the psyche, this time using not a house, but a volcano as an image. And you can see various layers. There you go. And this was done in 1925, this volcano image. But Jung is quick to remind us in various places that while psyche is informed by history, it is not determined by it. To him, psyche retains an autonomous, living, and creative capacity that transcends historical conditions. Furthermore, Jung found history useful, particularly when it could provide confirmation or parallels to his own ideas. Archetypal images, the God image in particular, mandala symbols of wholeness, the Savior archetype, these are among the many images that Jung claimed could be found all over the world and in every epoch of history. They confirmed for him the universality of the archetype. A particular example of this kind of confirmation lies in Jung's essay on the concept of the Trinity, which identified a variety of pre-Christian parallels to Trinitarian thinking in Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek sources. And from this, Jung was persuaded that the Christian Trinity was an expression of a universal archetype, not simply an artifact of Christianity. Slide 6 now. Other historical research also brought much needed validation to Jung's thinking, particularly given his relative isolation from the professional life of his times. He studied Gnostic texts extensively, and in them he found a source, quote, that gave substance to my psychology, and everything then fell into place. Likewise with alchemy, which he studied for years. He found in alchemy the historical counterpart of my psychology of the unconscious. Through alchemy, Jung writes, I arrived at the central concept of my psychology, the process of individuation. And slide 7. And when Richard Wilhelm introduced Jung to the ancient Taoist Buddhist text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, Jung found there what he called undreamed of confirmation of my ideas. It broke through my isolation, Jung declared, and allowed him to engage seriously with Eastern philosophy. Beyond confirmation, historical consciousness was also an important element of therapy for Jung. Since the individual soul contained a microscopic version of the whole human past, then a more complete understanding of the psyche of any patient required historical awareness. Jung applied this insight to himself, actually, when he acknowledged that I am under the influence of things or questions that were left incomplete or unanswered by my parents, grandparents, and more distant ancestors. And so therapists needed to know not only the personal and family histories of their patients, but also the social atmosphere and the contemporary history within which they are living. Jung wrote, the psyche is not only a personal but a world problem, and the psychiatrist has to deal with an entire world. What sort of world does our patient come from, and to what sort of world has he had to adapt himself? Dream analysis as well, which is so central to Jung's psychoanalytic practice, also required historical awareness. In a technique that he called amplification, Jung made use of historical parallels as well as mythological and cultural materials to assist patients in finding meaning in their own dream images by locating them in a larger context. In yet another way, Jung found history useful in its role as a protective container for the psyche. Modern life, for Jung, had broken our connection with the past. Christianity no longer provided a secure home for Western men and women, and the modern cataract of progress, as he put it, has resulted in our loss of connection with the past, our uprootedness, which has given rise to the discontents of civilization. Individuals, he wrote, are in danger of becoming merely a particle in the mass, while for societies, the loss of roots and the lack of tradition neuroticize the masses and prepare them for collective hysteria. Connecting with our past, what Jung calls our historical family and our ancestral psyches, provides an antidote to this fragmentation. Slide 8. In fact, Jung felt that the tower at Bollingen served such a purpose for himself. It is as if a silent greater family stretching down the centuries were peopling the house. More broadly, he argued that everyone is born within a particular cultural tradition and can experience a meaningful life only when he or she is in relationship to that tradition. Thus, history, both objective and archetypal, can serve as a container for deeply troubled modern people who desperately need a living sense of history and an awareness of the continuity of historical development. Now, Jung also viewed history as a protective container for Westerners who were tempted to engage uncritically with other, perhaps exotic spiritual traditions. Slide 9. Certainly, he valued much about so-called primitive African and American cultures, as well as Asian spirituality, and he especially revered the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But he was also afraid of the impact that these traditions might have on Europeans. Jung himself, when he was in Kenya in 1925, experienced a dangerous psychic disturbance, what he called a spiritual peril, in his encounters with primitive African cultures. And he experienced what he said was a fear of going black under the skin. More frequently, however, Europeans turned to India, not to Africa, as Christianity atrophied. Slide 10. And of course, Jung visited India in the 1930s. And while he was able to express that Indian symbols effectively gave voice to the unconscious, he warned Europeans against abandoning their own traditions. Anyone who believes that he can simply take over Eastern forms of thought is uprooting himself, for they do not express our Western past. They strike no chord in our innermost being. We are rooted in Christian soil. To adopt Indian symbols, Jung cautioned, would be playing false with our own history, thereby covering our nakedness with the gorgeous trappings of the East, as the Theosophists do. Jung's own visit to India, impressive though it was, ended with a dream in which reminded him that India was not my task, given the perilous state of Europe at the time. And so, for Jung, however flawed, limited, and diminished it was, the Western and Christian tradition, informed by the rational traditions of history, science, and now psychology, remained for Jung a better container for encountering the unconscious and promoting Western health. While archetypes were universal, their particular symbols and images reflected the historical cultures in which they arose, and so, according to Jung, it's better to stick with your own. There is perhaps more than a little touch of Eurocentrism in this assessment. But I wondered if Jung would take the same approach now, today. In the many years since Jung died, quite a number of Asian traditions have taken root in the West: Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufi forms of Islam, Taoism, and they have attracted a large number of practitioners. Some of them have become at least partially Westernized or Americanized. And at the same time, Christianity has continued to decline, in some places becoming so politicized as to lose almost any connection to inner life. And spiritual but not religious outlooks have been on the rise. And so in these circumstances, I wonder whether he would still feel so strongly that Westerners could not find an authentic connection to spirit beyond the Western tradition. Now, I'd like to turn away from these general ways in which Jung used history to how he applied these ideas to a particular situation, namely the Nazi phenomenon. Jung was an eyewitness and a participant in these events, and he acknowledged how troubling it was to him. In 1946, he wrote an essay entitled "After the Catastrophe," and he said that it was the most difficult essay he had ever written. "I had not realized how much I myself was affected," he said. Furthermore, Jung admitted a measure of early ambivalence in 1933, 1934, when Hitler first seized power. It seemed plausible at that time to speak in favor of the regime, at least in terms of restoring some order to German society. But he quickly changed his mind and confessed to a sense of mystery about it. One is at a loss to imagine how anything quite so monstrous came to power, he wrote in the After the Catastrophe essay. Nonetheless, even though he found the Nazi phenomenon very difficult to understand, he bravely sought to understand this development. Now, as far as I can tell, there is no single place where Jung outlines definitively his take on the Nazi phenomenon, but it is possible to piece together a relatively coherent Jungian explanation for it, and that is what I have tried to do. Now, Jung places the Nazi phenomenon squarely in the context of the major themes of modern world history. Chief among them, for Jung, was the deterioration of Christianity as its symbols increasingly lost any sense of being a lived experience and emotionally accessible to people. For Jung, the Renaissance began this process as it exchanged the heavenly goal for an earthly one. Then the Reformation made what he called a breach in the protective wall of sacred images, the iconoclasm of the Reformation. The Enlightenment furthered this de-Christianization of the West by raising questions about whether religion could be considered believable or reasonable. And then the French Revolution, slide 11, the French Revolution enthroned the goddess of reason in the Notre Dame Cathedral, of all places. And the image at the bottom right there is from the era of the French Revolution and shows the revolutionaries squeezing coins out of the fat priests. As a result, for Jung, by the 20th century, Europeans were living, quote, a lifeless nature bereft of gods. A living religion for him had become a comatose creed. And Jung had experienced this religious deterioration personally. You may remember the incident that he recorded in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections about what happened after his first communion, in which he simply said, nothing happened. And of course, in his interaction with his father and noticing the religious collapse of his father's understanding of Christianity. And since religion contributed so much to social cohesion, Jung viewed the weakening of the Christian church as generating intellectual, political, and social anarchy. Thus, in the vacuum created by the death of God, modern man was in search of a soul. The weakening authority of the church likewise allowed for its replacement by the state, because Christianity had given individuals an immortal soul, which gave them a point of leverage, a point of resistance, a place from which to critique and resist the state. Without that, however, the path to totalitarianism lay open. Slide 12. Furthermore, Jung realized that industrialization had everywhere uprooted millions and herded them together in large urban centers where they experienced sharp class conflicts and became dependent on a fluctuating market economy. And there, he wrote, in that industrial urban setting, people were torn from the soil, engaged in one-sided employment, lacking every healthy instinct and dependent on the state. These conditions generated individuals who were unstable, insecure, and suggestible. Slide 13. And alongside industrialization, modern science further undermined the validity of religious life and promoted secularism. Under the influence of scientific materialism, Jung wrote, everything that could be seen with the eye or touched with the hands was held in doubt. It was an unexampled revolution of man's outlook on the world. Moreover, scientific understandings of society gave rise to what he called a statistical world picture in which the individual becomes a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics, an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. And so, scientific rationalism contributed to the making of mass-mindedness, which robs the individual of his foundations and his dignity. Now, to Jung, this evolving pattern of European cultural and social history, the kind of history that historians study and write about, this kind of history, for Jung, triggered within the unconscious a profound psychic disturbance, which he described as a colossal explosion, a revolution of minds. To Jung, it bore comparison with the religious transformation of the early Christian centuries when, quote, Rome began to find the old gods ridiculous and the unconscious burst forth and brought back things immemorially buried. Jung commented ironically on the psychic outcomes of this process. He said, just when people were congratulating themselves on having abolished all spooks, it turned out that the spooks were flitting about the heads of apparently normal Europeans. Interestingly enough, Jung also suggested that the rediscovery of the unconscious dated back to the time of the French Revolution, where it was known as animal magnetism. And so the evolution of analytical psychology itself was further evidence of this psychic upheaval. Now, for Jung, the atrophy of Christianity, as well as the industrial and scientific revolutions, as well as the consequent onslaught of primitive forces, all of this was broadly a European or Western phenomenon. But if these conditions were so widely shared in the Western world, why then did the Nazi explosion occur in Germany rather than somewhere else? One answer that Jung provides was the, quote, marked proneness of Germans to mass psychology. Military defeat in World War I and the social upheaval that followed had what he calls increased the herd instinct in Germany, which permitted dormant unconscious forces to break through all moral barriers. Now, to have brought these forces to consciousness and assimilated them would have required what he later described as the critical reason of a fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population, which Germany clearly lacked. On the contrary, its system of moral and political education, Jung argued, had generated a spirit of dull obedience in the population. And so the inability of a sufficient number of Germans to individuate, that is, to become whole and indivisible and distinct from other people or collective psychology, made it impossible for them to engage in large-scale resistance to the mass-mindedness of the Nazi phenomenon. And beneath these social-cultural factors lay a deeply rooted sense of inferiority. Coming to political unity only in 1871, an event which Jung claimed was calamitous, Germany was already behind the French and the English in establishing nationhood. They also resented their meager pickings in the scramble for colonies which followed in the late 19th century. But their impressive industrial development, in Jung's words, dangled before them the tempting bait of power, aggrandizement, national arrogance. They sold their souls to technology and devoted their highest aspirations to forces of destruction. And so, with the defeat in World War I, the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, in slide 14, and the impoverishment that followed, this sense of inferiority and resentment only intensified. It was in these conditions, Jung found, the ground for the dragon's teeth from which National Socialism sprang up, as he invoked the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Now, slide 15. So for Jung, the Nazi movement was an archetypally informed compensatory response to what he called an abnormal state of mind. That archetypal image was Wotan, an ancient German god of storm and frenzy who unleashed passions, expressed the lust of battle, and was skilled in magic and illusion. For Jung, the awakening of Wotan, like the explosion of an extinct volcano, explained National Socialism better than any combination of economic, political, and psychological factors. And this is interesting because generally Jung is averse to cause and effect thinking. And yet, in this case, he found Wotan, quote, quite suitable as a causal hypothesis. Quite suitable as a causal hypothesis. In particular, it explained the sense of irrational seizure or possession that characterized the German embrace of Hitler and the Nazis, and which brought the whole of Germany to its feet, he wrote, from 5-year-olds to veterans. So to Jung, the Nazi phenomenon was a national psychic epidemic, and Nazi Germany was a case chart of a historical patient. Here was the awakening of Wotan, which Jung regarded as a fundamental attribute of the German psyche. It represented the autonomous powers of the psyche and the instinctual and emotional aspect of the unconscious. And for Jung, it suggested that the Germans might well be regarded as victims and not only responsible agents. That's an interesting sort of idea, that possession by Wotan turned the Germans into victims and not agents of the disaster that followed. Now, when symbols such as Wotan become widespread, Jung argued that a mob emerges and soon finds a leader. And that leader, of course, was Hitler. In the chaos of the early 1930s, Hitler spoke about a new order for a very disordered Germany. And that, Jung declared, is the real reason why practically every German fell for him. But on a deeper psychic level, Hitler came to personify the Wotan archetype for millions of Germans who were already infected by it. He was a reflected image of the collective German hysteria, carrying its shadow and its sense of inferiority. Slide 16. Jung actually saw Hitler at a mass rally sometime in the late 1930s and expressed amazement that such a psychic scarecrow with his ranting speeches delivered in shrill, grating, womanish tones could command loyalty for so many people. But he did, and Jung explained it psychologically. Slide 17. Hitler is the mirror of every German's unconscious. He is the loudspeaker which magnified the German soul, which magnified the inaudible whispers of the German soul until they can be heard by Germany's conscious ear. Hitler's power is not political, it is magic. Now, I don't think Jung knew this, but it turns out that Hitler was examined by a doctor when he was in prison in the early 1920s. And the doctor's diagnosis was that Hitler was given to magical thinking. So Jung might have very much appreciated that had he known about it. So, despite Jung's frequent insistence on the autonomy of the psyche and the relative unimportance of historical events, he does seem to me to grant a considerable degree of agency to the processes of 19th and 20th century European history in terms of their impact on the psyche. Precisely how he would define this agency, was it a cause, was it activation, was it influence, was it a stimulus, is not clear to me. What is clear is that for Jung, history and psyche were thoroughly entangled, and causation went both ways. Now, slide 18. It was Jung's concept of compensation, applicable collectively as well as to individuals, that allowed Jung to engage seriously with historical events, despite his reservation about objective history. To Jung, compensation means that any deficiency in consciousness, such as exaggeration, one-sidedness, or lack of function, is suitably supplemented by an unconscious process. Only a faulty consciousness can call forth a counter-move on the part of the unconscious. So to Jung, compensation is a natural, automatic, and self-regulating adjustment intended to restore psychic balance. Because it begins in conscious life, compensation opens the door for Jung to a meaningful engagement with ordinary history, more so than some of his statements about the unimportance of history might suggest. So, how does Jung's approach to history stack up against that of professional historians? Certainly, Jung did not do history in the fashion of historians, although he certainly made use of history in many ways to create meaning. Ordinary historians create meaning by giving definition to the human past, for example, by identifying patterns, analyzing change, establishing context, noticing connections, and assessing cause and effect. Jung's distinctive contribution to this meaning-making enterprise of history was his inclusion of what Aniela Jaffe called another dimension to the conscious world of the individual and of contemporary history, namely the collective unconscious. According to her, Jung found meaning in the visible as well as the invisible, in the greatest as well as in the most trivial events. Jung's outlook, argued the American psychotherapist Ira Progoff, had magnitude as well as depth, because it gave to humankind a point of contact with the world as cosmos. And so it seems to me that Jung's great achievement was to sketch the constant interplay of psychology and history, and in doing so, he was able to provide a large and a rich context illuminating the condition of modern humankind. All of this makes Jung attractive to people who are able to entertain the reality of a realm beyond the material. Spiritual seekers, both religious and secular, often find a kindred spirit in Jung. And to bring this down more to the present, those of us who are trying to probe the deeper roots of the Trump phenomenon and the global rise of authoritarian movements may find some resonance in Jung's discussion of the psychic epidemic that transfixed much of Germany during the Nazi era. Furthermore, and this is another similarity between Jung and ordinary historians, because we share a sense of mission about our work, a belief that some knowledge of the past can be useful in the present. My own field of world history, for example, emerged after World War II with a belief that a global past might temper some of the nationalist excesses of the more recent history. Jung believed that historical understanding had an important role in individual therapy, and according to Murray Stein, Jung sought the psychotherapeutic transformation of nothing less than Christianity itself. In both cases, he was a doctor of souls using history as a tool for healing. And like historians whose work comes up against the present and looks to the future, Jung found himself uncertain and ambivalent. On the one hand, he could be quite pessimistic about human potential, noting the catastrophic impact of the hydrogen bomb and observing that, quote, the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities, to put it mildly. On the other hand, to Jung, the psyche is inherently creative. It constantly generates new images, symbols, and myths. It seeks to integrate the fragmented elements of our disjointed personalities, and it works toward the freedom of the individuation process. So Jung displays what seems to me to be an admirable ambivalence about the future. Now, beyond these commonalities between Jungians and ordinary historians, there are clear differences as well. Jung himself was implicitly critical of academic historical writing because he felt that it generally dismissed the underlying psychological dynamics of history. In his commentary on the Secret of the Golden Flower, he wrote that Europe's, quote, tremendously extensive historical and scientific knowledge is the greatest obstacle to introspection. Moreover, as a man of his times, Jung embraced various ideas that have much less resonance today. One of them was racial stereotypes. His analysis of the differences between Jewish and German psychology led to a misunderstanding about his relationship to the Nazi regime. And in a 1988 article, the British psychotherapist Farhad Dalal triggered a major controversy in the Jungian world when he labeled Jung a racist, insisting that Jung regarded blacks as inferior and not just different. Furthermore, Jung's frequent distinction between primitive and civilized societies dates him. He once referred to Ethiopians as a peaceful, half-civilized people. And his contrast between a mystical, introverted East, India, and a rational, extroverted West, Europe, might well seem Eurocentric or essentialist today. But the big problem for historians with Jung's understanding of the past is verification. While Jung, as an empirical scientist, sought to avoid metaphysical statements, his central notion of the collective unconscious transcended historical time, evoking another realm beyond the material and the empirical. So how are down-to-earth historians, like me, supposed to assess the evidence of dreams, visions, alchemical formulations, Gnostic writings, astrological ideas, mandalas, and myths? What are we to do with that kind of material as when we are operating as historians? Furthermore, I wondered, as I was doing this, whether European concepts applied to particular historical events are really necessary, even if they are evocative. For example, might historians of the Nazi era adequately account for Hitler's appeal to the German people without invoking Wotan? Perhaps grievances and resentments associated with the Treaty of Versailles, inflation, the Great Depression, political dysfunction, and pervasive anti-Semitism, perhaps those things provide enough explanation without worrying too much about Wotan. And yet, historians too often encounter emotions such as anger, fear, and resentment, love, loyalty, and devotion. Numinous or religious states of mind and identities of all kinds are a commonplace in historical writing, national identity, ethnic, class, and gendered identities. Surely these are psychological phenomena, though for historians they are limited to the temporal world of human life and necessarily exclude the timeless world of spirit and archetypes. Nonetheless, the line between ordinary cultural history and Jungian psychic history is perhaps not so sharp as I had originally thought. There are also differences in our understanding of historical change. Historians seek to explain change and to assess cause and effect. And in doing so, we often use the notion of conjuncture, the coinciding of various events or processes. And that notion of conjuncture is helpful in explaining the timing and the reality of change. For Jung, of course, the dynamics of the psyche take precedence over such issues. The primary mechanism of change for Jung is not historical conjuncture, but psychological compensation and personal individuation, or its absence. Thus, the awakening of Wotan for Jung, Wotan, who was a shadow image long dormant within German Christian culture, burst into consciousness as Christianity atrophied and became one-sided, and as modern life challenged long-established social patterns. And it was the inability of most Germans to individuate and to assimilate their own shadow that led to the projection of those unleashed forces outward with horrendous consequence. While this kind of analysis represents a meaningful context in which to frame the Nazi phenomenon, it simply lies outside the canons of historical evidence and comes close to denying cause and effect analysis. No psychological fact, Jung wrote, can ever be explained in terms of causality alone. And so, in my role as a practicing historian, albeit retired, I am unable to actively incorporate Jungian concepts such as the collective unconscious, archetypes, compensation, individuation, and the like in my efforts to do history. In the same way, I cannot embrace God as a historical actor, although many people do and find meaning in it. These are matters that lie beyond the purview of working historians who must limit themselves to verifiable evidence in the empirical world. It may well be that our profession has been limited by its development in a scientifically based culture, although postmodernism has eroded earlier assumptions about the certainty and objectivity of historical analysis. This assessment is not so much a criticism of Jungian history as it is a recognition of epistemological difference. The historians community and the Jungian community give consent to different definitions of history and of different definitions of evidence and knowledge. Practicing one of them does not invalidate the other, and we can shuttle between them. Speaking personally, I greatly admire the extent of Jung's historical awareness and his skill in connecting it meaningfully to the inner life of humankind. Given his reservations about ordinary history, I have been surprised by how frequently he invokes the great events of world history and how deftly he has woven them together with psychic or archetypal material into a rich explanatory tapestry. Slide 19. But I am not only a historian, I am also, like many of us, a seeker. And so I am grateful beyond measure to Jung for his compelling affirmation of the reality of soul, or what he called the world system of spirit. Where else, he asks, do our good and helpful flashes of intelligence come from? What else is the source of our enthusiasm, inspirations, and of our heightened feeling for life? Truth that appeals only to the testimony of the senses may satisfy reason, but it offers nothing to stir our feelings by giving a meaning to human life. And to that sentiment, I can only add, Amen. Thank you.
Can you pass down that other copy that you were gonna let me
The other
use
copy of,
your talk?
yeah,
There were so many things in it that it was like I was making mental notes, and after a while,
oh, okay, sure.
can you grab?
Well, I make actual notes.
Well,
For you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for treating this topic. Since I have had some acquaintance with the development of your talk, I have connections and points of departure. But before I say anything, I'd rather know about anybody in the rest of our audience. If anyone has anything to say or hear.
Any hands?
Well, I was just gonna ask you about Wotan specifically, because in the ring, Wotan is the chief god, and he's actually a fairly avuncular character. He's not imperious, he's not shoving people about like some of them in the ring. He's more kind of above everybody and relatively peaceful. And that was Wagner's take on it. And I know Hitler was very much enchanted with the ring.
yeah,
So it's a little bit of a dichotomy.
well, that, yeah, I don't know. I am not familiar with the mythological material on Wotan. But the Wotan that Hitler invoked was a rather more terrifying character. But some of the rest of you may know much more than I do about the mythological background to Wotan.
I know.
Well, but Hitler took lots of
Speak up,
mythology
David.
out of context. A lot of it, and maybe entirely, he took it out of context on purpose to make a point.
Okay.
And the historical significance was not important, significantly anyway, to the end that he wanted to achieve, to arouse the people, which he was quite good at.
The characters of gods in mythology tend to shift around depending on context. Their characters don't really hold still that well.
So what about, I mean, sorry to bring Gebser in again, but, you know, to the extent that, as you said, it's an epistemological difference. So there are some who want to stay within like a narrow epistemology of evidence and rationality. There are some who want to stay within a narrow epistemological relevance of mythology and archetype. And then there are people like Gebser who say, well, actually it's all operative.
Okay, yeah.
And at some, you know, level, we would do well, not we ought, but we would do well to find the, you know, like weave them together and try to see the pattern, not just our warp or woof type of threads. And that's where you started getting to. You got there at the end.
Yes. There has been some discussion of this. There's a British psychotherapist named Kevin Liu, L-U, who has written a couple of articles. In fact, the only ones that I've been able to find that directly address this topic of Jung and history. And he is trying to find those points of connection. but he's not a professional historian. He did write an article about Toynbee, in which he tried to identify Jungian influence on Toynbee's challenge and response theory of history. Toynbee, however, is not widely regarded in a positive way among professional historians these days. As I think he is considered as being too mystical and not sufficiently rooted in concrete evidence. So this divide is still very much at play. It does strike me, however, that postmodernism, which has challenged the early 20th century notion that history could be a science with the same kind of certainty that chemistry or biology had, that has been called into question. And calling it into question opens up the possibility of some psychoanalytic insights. But as far as I can tell, it has not much entered the historical profession. Although, in fact, when we deal with these emotional factors, it does seem that it is possible to make that connection. Kevin Liu argued that one thing historians could learn from psychoanalytic ideas is to be more sensitive to the emotional dimensions of history.
You know what would be interesting for future professional historians? Because the evidence for kind of what was going on in the collective is only given by those who bothered to write it down. So people who have, a literary bent or a one, they have to be educated. Two, they have to have a motivation to write it down. And three, they probably have, a particular worldview coming out of their own educational circumstances. However, in modern times, the collective, the collective is it's on Twitter, it's on Facebook. It's like there is evidence
Too much.
too much of what is going on in the collective psyche. And
Poland,
historians will be able to analyze that data in a whole different way than they can analyze Thucydides.
Yes. And Poland is another such source.
Yeah.
Well, just thinking about the anger that we know about. So we know about the anger and the despair, and there's been a lot of polls taken, people going out and getting actual data about the status of the emotions of why people are not, for instance, voting for healthcare for themselves. It's because they don't want the others to have it. So they're getting all of that information now that seems people weren't able to get before.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the places where sort of ordinary cultural history may come to similar conclusions without necessarily using Jungian language.
Yeah. Just using the language.
Bob, I was going to ask you, you've sort of clearly delineated the difference between the causal approach to history versus, let's call it, the acausal that Jung was certainly enamored of. I guess I look at this as a both and the statement that you read of Jung's, he didn't completely reject the role of causal factors in explaining history. It seems to me it's a bit of a mix. It can be viewed causally and acausally. It is there's enough room there to interpret historical events through a combination of the two, rather than saying that it's got to be one or the other.
Yes,
And
that's-
at times it's hard to distinguish those two.
yes, yes. And it surprised me, frankly, as I got into this. I mean, when I started this, I didn't expect to come out where I ended up. I expected to be much more critical of Jung for his sort of mystical tendencies. But the more I got into it, and the more I looked at how he wrote about the Nazi phenomenon, and the more I understood the notion of compensation. I mean, compensation begins in the conscious world, which
That's
is to
right.
say,
Yeah.
which is to say that it begins with history, ordinary history, and
Right.
then it provokes a response from psyche, from the collective unconscious. But the fact that Jung so frequently invoked the great events, which he, in another place, regarded as profoundly unimportant, and gave them such agency, was surprising to me, and sort of belied some of the more adamant statements that he made about the unimportance of ordinary history. So I think that in practice, he does see this mixture that is going on. And
Yeah, because I mean, if you again bring it down to the individual and how you approach an individual's work, it's a combination of both the outer inner causal versus the acausal. They're at play, constantly at play, and they're also eliciting the compensatory reactions within psyche. So I would scale that up to the masses and say you can look at that that play between the two on a collective level as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering.
Doesn't say it's easy to distinguish those, but yeah.
I was wondering about Freud, if he took on this whole debacle, what was going on in Germany, and do you know, was he involved in the psychological mechanisms of history?
You know, I honestly know nothing about what Freud's take on the Nazi phenomenon was. I'm an amateur Jungian, and I'm not even an amateur Freudian. But maybe somebody else knows.
Well, his response to the World War I was writing Civilization and Its Discontent, which is a psychoanalytic analysis of the First World War. I mean, he died early in, when the Second World War was just beginning when he died, so he didn't have time to, I think, analyze that. Although he was very much affected by it. Both he and Anna had been interrogated by the Gestapo, and had to flee Vienna. So, but I will say this: the first attempt to apply depth psychology to history was from the Freudian school. And there's a whole movement of psychohistory that there is a journal of psychohistory, which is mainly Freudian based, neo-Freudian based. So there is this very keen interest in applying Freudian psychoanalytic thought to interpreting history, far more so than in the Jungian world.
I have a question about history, being a historian. What constitutes evidence?
What constitutes evidence?
What is considered adequate evidence?
Well, one criteria, I think, is ability to replicate. That is, historians want to think that if the same people have access to the same documents or to the same sources of evidence, that they will be able to come up with reasonably similar conclusions. Now, that's not always the case,
Yeah, I bet
of
it
course.
isn't.
Yes. Now, traditionally, history has depended on written evidence. It's only more recently that we have been able to make use of archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, evidence from DNA analyses that.
And so, but if something's written down, then that doesn't make it true.
No. It
What do
doesn't
you
make
do
it
with
true.
that?
It doesn't make it true, but it means that it is concrete, that it is something that various people can look at. It doesn't mean that historians take everything that they read at face value. I mean, our whole training is to
But that's what I'm curious about is
to criticize the evidence, to try to assess where it came from and why
what
certain
those
people
were
work in certain
thinking.
ways. And this is another place that Kevin Liu suggests that psychoanalytic stuff can be helpful historiographically.
Yeah,
You know, in trying to understand why certain documents appear in a certain fashion at a certain time from a certain group of people. And of course, our whole concern about prejudice or bias has to do with this kind of thing. Do men write history or record history differently than women, white than blacks?
well, and does one man record a historical record differently than the next guy who's right next to him in culture, you know?
Yes,
Just
yes.
The next
Well-
guy at the table.
Well,
And the answer would be probably yeah.
yes, of course. And that's the job of historians, is to sort that evidence and to try to come to some conclusions.
Because bias is gonna be there, right? And
It came out of a
everybody
human.
has a point of view that they take to the historical evidence. But then if you have enough people investigating the events, the hope is that some of the bias can be mitigated, or even a bias can be fruitful. You know, just different ways of looking at the same thing. That's a good thing. It's not necessarily bad that everybody comes to different ways of looking at the world.
And I look at bias slightly differently. I'd say, well, what is
You're biased about bias, is that what you're saying?
yes, but the rules of engagement for historians is that there are rules that are that you apply in order to determine how you look at history, or what you include in history or not, and what biases are applied there, so that so some things are thrown out or some things are kept. Some things are thrown out should be kept, and some things are kept that should be thrown out simply because of the biases of the rules of engagement.
Yes, and I mean, for example, it's no accident that the feminist movement has coincided with the rise of importance of women's history.
Right.
Or it's no accident that environmental history has flourished as we became more environmentally aware.
Yes.
So that our problems in the present frequently shape the questions we ask about the past.
Yes.
And I think most historians these days have lost that sense of history as a science that can come up with the kind of certainty that Karl Marx felt, for example. You know, Marx thought he was a scientist and that he had come up with the laws of historical development that paralleled Newton's laws of gravity and so forth, and the motion of objects. But very few, if any, historians nowadays accept that. There is an effort. I have sometimes compared the task of historian to the task of Sisyphus. You know, he pushes that rock up the hill only to have it roll down again. And historians too seek to push the rock up the hill, seek to set aside our most obvious biases or prejudices and to find out what really happened. And yet nobody is confident that we can actually do that.
That's good.
And so that is the nobility of the historian's task. We continue to try to push the rock up the hill, even while we believe that it is impossible to reach any final effort in that.
Well, the more you do it, the more you understand the
That's
contours of the hill
And the rock.
Yes, yes,
and the rock,
yes,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, hopefully you at least get out of its way when it comes rolling down.
So,
And one's own strength or not.
a case in point is this weekend there's going to be a play about Mozart's older sister. Yes, she was on equal footing with Mozart during her life and his life. Equal footing, maybe even better in the circle of music in Europe at that time. Within 100 years of her death,
She disappeared.
she became a footnote, not even a footnote in history.
Yeah.
And I say, we're missing, there was clearly a bias there of some sort, so, I'm just making a case in point, for where I was.
They
Yes.
didn't put her in the movie. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
She didn't
I
even,
don't remember her.
she was, yes, not in the movie, it wasn't, but, and yet
But he
during
didn't
his.
even have a sister in that movie.
Yeah, and she was older than he was, so his older sister.
Wow.
And she was really talented, I mean, certainly as talented as Mozart was.
Interesting.
And, the Mozart, she was. So, yeah.
So what evidence is there for this?
Good question.
That was my question exactly, is I think you raise everything there, David. Number one is, do I believe
How do
anything
you
you just
know?
said?
You don't have to believe, there is a record in her music. So there is a record that exists,
And I can find it.
and you can find it.
And I
Is
can
it a
verify it.
33 or a 45?
Yeah, maybe 78. And you can go, there is a historical record, archives, where you can go and search and find out, where did she perform, how many people were there, and so forth,
Yeah.
in those times, and so you can add that all up.
So you're appealing in that adding up
Yeah.
to what Bob characterizes,
Yes.
generally speaking,
Yes,
as an appropriate approach of a historian. That
Yes.
is, there are materials available that can back up your story.
right, but it also has to be a will to do that.
And where is this play?
I think it's gonna be at the Sunset Center.
Ooh.
Well, so
They're
there,
doing a women in music thing over in the next weeks at Sunset Center. And this is I think the opening for that.
Are they gonna play some of her music?
Yes.
Oh, I'd like to go see that. With regard to, what you said here about, oh shoot, now I've lost my page. Oh, here we go, here it is. The psychic epidemic, you said to Jung, so we're talking about Nazi Germany. To Jung, it was a national psychic epidemic. And Nazi Germany was a case chart of a hysterical patient. Yeah. So then a little later on, you say that Hitler is the mirror of every German's unconscious.
That's Jung, that's
Jung.
not me.
Yeah, right, that's, you're quoting Jung. He is the loudspeaker which magnified the inaudible whispers of the German soul until they can be heard by Germany's conscious ear. Hitler's power is not political, it is magic. I mean, that just characterizes Trump
Yes,
so to a T right now that it makes me wonder the extent to which America's if Trump is being the loudspeaker, and he's said as much,
yes.
I
I will be your revenge.
Yeah, and he is our psychic scarecrow with his ranting speeches delivered in shrill, grating, womanish tones. I mean, so I know I'm rambling, I'm getting there. So to the extent that we Americans would be able to hear the inaudible whispers of the American soul in a conscious way. And this question is for all of us, not just for you. What is our soul saying?
Scared. People are scared. They're scared the world is changing so fast and they don't recognize it anymore. That's what I think. Deep insecurity.
And resentments.
And yeah, resentments, a need to project that insecurity and do something about it.
Any other responses?
Well, the important thing is that Trump didn't do anything except enrich the already rich class with his tax cuts. And so the data doesn't explain anything. It is a bewitchment because he's so other than what has been before. And so let's pull the whole house down and start again. That's what you get from him. You get that feeling like he's gonna change everything, even for the worse. But he didn't, and he probably, when he gets in, there's hopefully gonna be enough restraint on him that is he just a big talker because he's got a big old mouth, and how much harm did he do last time? How much harm have other leaders like Biden done in the meantime? I mean, I maybe shouldn't make this comparison, but it's just that he's almost he's pushing above his weight in terms of the charisma and the I can fix everything, and you also recognize the hollowness of him, or maybe I'm just being hopeful, but he's like a scarecrow.
He looks broken to me.
So you said something interesting, that the evidence that's there is that he's basically given, these immense tax cuts to the rich. And so it's like there's this bifurcation in our soul where how do you say this? You know, the rich are such a minority, and they're not the ones out there, you know, like making noise and sending white powder to judges and invading the, you know, the Capitol building. They're not the ones with the resentment, and so what really boggles me about Trump is that he's doing things that benefit a certain group of people that are not his base, but the base just eats. I'm not saying this very well. There's a contradiction. There's this huge contradiction between what he does and who he benefits, and who like really gets behind him and supports him.
Well, Trump is evidence that culture trumps class. Identity issues are more prominent for Trump's base than class-related economic issues. And I think that was true for the Nazis as well, except that in the Nazi era, Hitler did solve the economic problem. By 1938, there was no more unemployment in Germany, at a time when the United States still had 25% unemployment. So Hitler did solve that class problem, that unemployment issue. And that satisfied.
Didn't he do it by like borrowing to the hilt?
Well, he did it by building the Autobahns, by building Volkswagens, and by rearming.
Yeah.
Now, honestly, I'm not aware of the tax structure of Germany in the 1930s, but it did strike me that by blaming a lot of this on the Jews, he was invoking cultural issues in the same way that Trump does when he invades against Mexicans and migrants and Muslims. But the issues seem to me to be more related to cultural stuff, identity issues, you know, and that so many whites fear being replaced, apparently. And some of the Hitler rhetoric about the Jews was along the same lines, that they are destroying the Aryan race. And this is an interesting thing that I noticed about Jung's discussion of the Nazis. He focused largely on war and aggression, not on racial purification. Jeff told me that Jung only used the word Holocaust twice in his writings, at least that Jeff is aware of. And I was wondering whether Jung actually read Mein Kampf. It was clearly available to him, but I've looked online just today and could find no evidence that he actually was aware of Mein Kampf. But the central issue of Mein Kampf is racial purification. Mm-hmm. And the other stuff is there, war and aggression. But I think Jung downplayed or missed the centrality of racial purification in the Nazi platform.
And if identity is at the core of it, then I mean, identity is a psychological issue.
Yes, indeed.
I think identity may be central to this because in the early 20s, to the late 20s, there was a power vacuum in Germany, and partly imposed by the West, so that there was no faction that could actually, in fact, run Germany properly. I mean, you can look at Bismarck; he's been not functioning during that period, which allowed this vacuum to be there, which Hitler clearly saw. This vacuum, and Mein Kampf was the result of his how he saw he could take advantage of that. So by by the late 20s, when he got out of prison, he was ready to go. And there wasn't anything in his way, really. There was no group who could stand up to or counter the arguments.
There was the Depression. In 1928, in German elections in 1928, the Nazi Party got about 2% of the vote.
Right.
In 1932, I think they got about 32% of the vote, something like that.
But it was
So,
sufficient.
what?
But it was sufficient in
Yes,
32.
yes. I mean, by the early 30s, Germany was one of the worst hit areas of the world in terms of the economic consequences of the Depression.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered if the Depression had not occurred, whether the Nazis would have been just a footnote. And so,
Bob, what effect do you think that the Versailles Treaty had on Germany's ability to deal with the Depression?
A great deal.
yes. The Versailles Treaty and the political dysfunctions. The Weimar Republic never achieved solid footing. It was undermined by these wounded warriors from World War I who believed that they had been stabbed in the back. They didn't trust the Weimar Republic. It was the Weimar Republic or some of its people who actually signed the Treaty of Versailles. And so all of that contributed to the ability of Hitler to appeal to people. But still, without the Depression, and that is a major difference now in our country. I think the identity issue is far more important here now, because we have 4% unemployment now.
Right, yeah, it's the lowest it's been in a long time.
We don't have 25 or 30% unemployment. So that's a big difference. And it speaks to the prominence of the cultural issue and the resentments that are associated with those identity issues.
To what extent are the resentments like really burned into the culture, particularly like even Jesus knew that it is human tendency to look down upon people who are like culturally less than you, poorer, a different caste, whatever your culture way of organizing it is. He said, whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. Already back then, we knew that we treat people of higher status with more respect and more regard. And I think culturally that's going to have to be one of our psychological healings, to heal that tendency to think those who are royalty or richer or whatever are better, and those who are and get some greater sense of well, here's the French Revolution again, egalitarianism, like we're humans, we're all humans.
Well, it certainly is interesting that Trump seems to be able to appeal to at least some of those people who are, or who feel themselves to be lesser than.
Right, and he manipulates them by turning them against those who they think are lesser than them, and saying they're coming after your jobs, they're coming after your wives, they're gonna rape your daughters.
Well, and there are people like us, well-educated, relatively affluent, who look down on those people.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can send our children to the Ivy Leagues and other people can't.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, can I ask a question? In terms of Jung's analysis of what happened in Germany, you pointed out one of the key factors was the disintegration of Christianity, or at least a religion that could fulfill people's sense of spiritual connection to something transcendent. I'll put it that way. To what extent do you think that's playing a role now, not just here, but in other countries where authoritarianism is in the ascendance? Do you feel that that's an important factor, or it's not?
Well, that's interesting, Jeff. It certainly has continued. I mean, the exodus from mainline churches has continued, and even from evangelical churches is a prominent feature. And so in that sense, the fact that we don't have active religious symbols that we can relate to emotionally leaves the field open for other kinds of symbols, populist symbols, cultural symbols, political ideologies can take the place of what religion used to do without its transcendent function. So in that sense, yes.
I guess I should have asked you first, as a historian, do you actually accept that as a plausible part of the ascension of authoritarianism? The lack of a living living religious symbol or a people.
Well, it has been going on for quite some time in democratic as well as in more authoritarian states. So, and the embrace of Trump by the evangelicals, I suppose you could argue that embrace is a testimony of the extent to which religion no longer touches inner life, that evangelicals can embrace a person of that character.
But once again, we have the mythological layer amongst all the many strata we're walking through here. You spoke about Wotan in that context, and here there's quite a lot of apocalyptic imagery amongst in evangelical milieu that views Trump in a certain way, that views what's happening now in a certain way that's thoroughly mythological.
Yeah.
But there, and in the expansive sense of mythological, meaning not just superficial delusion, but mythological, meaning this is what is believed.
Especially in the evangelical embrace of Israel, is an eschatological mythology that is apparently very powerful.
Very powerful. Christian Zionism, yes. So you bring in that word too, power. Power is, and we can continue that. I just want for the moment to say, I really appreciate how in your responses and in the dialogue, we're actually exemplifying a dialogue between historical practice, shall we say, and then as a context. And we all have been here this evening, if I may say, basically accepting that, yes, when you refer to a historical context, you are speaking accurately. you have some basis of practice, of life and study and so forth to say, well, these patterns have been observed, they are evidentiary, and there's a level where we absorb that, and we need to absorb that to say, well, the French Revolution did happen. How do I know that it happened? What were various factors that we might say are important? I believe they very much are, to understanding the power of the French Revolution and what this meant in the history of Western civilization, but also in the emergence of consciousness, shall we say. I mean, we can talk about that here. But when we bring in the French Revolution or any other historical phenomenon of great significance, we rely on it. We rely on that context that the historians have devotedly provided for us.
Yeah.
As a context, it can be challenged, it can be, we can enter dialogue on it, but it's still a vital context to bring in analytical psychology, and then, as you say, for Jung to say, well, the major events of history are not really all that important. Well, from a psychological perspective, he is saying that, if we go into that quote exactly and dig into it, but that would be even to say, well, how do something such as the French Revolution, how does it play into the psyches of modern civilization, the American, European, whatever? Can we see some patterns here that are important, that are active, and that we learn about because of your practice? I mean,
Yes, that it is possible to reconstruct human societies was the lesson of the French Revolution, and the communists learned it and took it up. But to get back to Jeff's question for just a minute, you asked about religion, Jeff, and this brings up the difference between authentic inner experience of another realm and the institutional structures that condition it. Many of the revolutions of the modern era, including the French and the Mexican and the Russian, were directed, at least in part, against really corrupt, established religious institutions. And now, maybe they threw out the baby with the bathwater, but those structures impeded human development and human progress.
I think, again, we can bring some Jung in here, because his analysis of that whole question was rooted in something that he felt was instinctual, right? He felt very strongly that, along with all the other instincts that we are innately born with, there is also a religious instinct. There is something innate in our psyche that wants to create a living symbol that puts us in touch with more than this phenomenal physical world. And it's not something you can get rid of. You can't legislate it. You can't create a revolution. In fact, revolutions can be a manifestation of the religious instinct. They are the yearning within our psyches to create something that's more meaningful in a time when there is no meaning. And it's not that the religious instinct, as with all instincts, it can create, it can be very creative, but it can also be destructive. It can create a God that is loving and giving and supportive, but it can also create a monster that that can annihilate us. So, but it's there willy-nilly. We can't get rid of it, according to Jung. It will out. And so it's always there in, if a religion, a formal religion institution cannot provide a living symbol, a means to creatively put us in touch with the transcendent, then the religious function will seek elsewhere. It will find someone like a Trump and create, a numinosity around an individual like that, which is, again, very destructive.
And the
So,
communists.
that's all I needed to say. I mean, and just one thing, that this does not have to be provided by an institution, or an institution with creeds and dogmas. That the religious function can be met or addressed through us personally finding something that puts us in touch with the transcendent.
And I think some of the revolutions sought to do that.
Yes.
Many years ago, when I was in Russia, I visited Lenin's tomb, and it was a religious experience. They had, this was in 1988, I think, or 89, during the Gorbachev era, but there were lines of people still outside Lenin's tomb waiting to get in, and everybody was warned to be quiet. You had about 15 seconds alone with the embalmed Lenin by yourself, and then you were moved on. But it clearly was a religious experience. There was an element of transcendence there. I mean, if you could believe that the revolution was going to create a new earth, if not a new heaven. So there was a religious impulse in some of these revolutions. And I think
and so
the French one certainly, they enthroned the goddess of reason in Notre Dame, and they made up hymns to the goddess of reason that used the same music as the Christian hymns. So it's
people would use reason to
I would like to add something regarding what you were talking about at the very beginning when you were quoting Jung about the unconscious history and the history, the spirit of the time. And I think it goes well with what we just said with religion. The leap is wondering if we could make if we could explain the phenomenon of the resentment with a change of mythology. And in a way, try to see the equation as unconsciously people in a territory, in a culture, developing a resentment because of a change of narrative in the very foundation of the collective psyche. If you take the example of the French Revolution, the idea was this period of enlightenment that was affirming itself. And unconsciously, despite aside of the poverty, of the misery, of what was going on in the country, yes, God was dead and Descartes was almighty. Basically, the revolution was a translation of this, when you use the word, Jeff, loss of meaning, or a sort of craving for finding meaning again, but unconsciously. And if you bring that back to nowadays, yes, there is employment. Oh yes, there is misery too in the US. Uh, but aside of this, of the economics and the social, isn't there a disappearance of the American dream as understood by the previous generations? Isn't there like a disappearance of like this myth of power of the the frontier man that was going west, all the mythology associated with gun ownership that we talked about in this place years ago? Um, isn't it all of this changed by the diversification of populations, the what we call the American experiment, the fact that people from many countries and many cultures are now establishing well in this country and are showing their identity. Hence the opposition with like between the identity politics that have their shadow and these old ways of thinking. So this unconscious resentment of with a change of narrative that people do not accept is maybe at the root of the this this new conservatism that are not really conservatism but more populism and simplification to shelter unconsciously people. Um, I'm getting lost now, but I don't know. I hope you got something of what I was trying to say.
I'm not sure that I got all of that. In fact, my hearing aid batteries have just run out, so I'm a little bit at a disadvantage, and I didn't bring any with me. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking is that one of the fundamental changes in the modern era is the belief that human beings can, on their own, reconstruct human societies. You know, for so long, the existing social order was thought to be of divine origin, or at least sanctioned by God. But we no longer believe that now. We believe that we have the capacity, and we generally embrace this belief as a good thing, that we no longer are fated to remain in the condition in which we found ourselves, that we can and we should transform societies in accordance with certain ideals. Now, doing so, of course, raises all sorts of questions. Are we playing God here?
Can I address this? Because I take it up in my book. And yeah, there's a shift from, following divine order to understanding that we have a certain creative power. And when our own creativity gets out of balance, then, we create institutions that are one-sided, just, in mirroring our own one-sidedness. And so, maybe the next step, the next conjunctio, as Jung would call it, is to find the balance between the divine and the human, and dip back into the collective unconscious or the numinous to work, find a working relationship between what's divinely given and what's humanly given. I'm not saying it's easy, because that can lead to inflation of all sorts, and lying to oneself, and delusion. But my own personal sense is that's the third conjunction, and, you know, that's kind of where we need to head to.
Everybody would have to agree that they could see it differently.
Exactly. That's
And I think that's
exactly-
not what everybody's agreed to yet, that it's okay to see the numinous differently.
Yeah, I hear you, and that's a very important part of it.
Yes, but I was more hinting at if we look at the US, the collapse of, I would say, the narrative of the manifest destiny. This would be more precisely what I was thinking about if we want to take on the example of the US and the rise of populism. This is quite specific. The
Yeah,
belief that the constructed belief that this country was blessed by God and that it expanded and gained in power because of God, and that its creators, inhabitants, colons from the east propagated goodness toward the west, occupying the territory a few centuries ago, and that this is a justification for what this country is. And this narrative, this mythology is collapsing, and this creates resentment.
One thing we haven't emphasized very much is the political aspect of wealth, and you know, people are on the dole and feel dispossessed, and they have no self-respect because all the wealth has gone to the top. I mean, you can bring the church into it, and that can help, but the basic tasks of living a decent life are being lost for vast majority of people. And until that is addressed, of course, you know, the psyche is not going to be able to respond in any fruitful way. It's an obvious point, but it's the extraordinary inequality, and
yeah. What was the statistic that just came out? Jeff Bezos is now again the richest man in the world, and he has as much wealth as like the bottom 50% of all Americans, or the bottom 40%.
I mean, this is
It's
absurd,
yeah.
and to not think about that as the major problem is also taking your eye off the real thing.
Well, one of the things that struck me in this reading of Jung that I've been doing is the great difficulty of imagining any substantial change. If change, as Jung says, depends upon a lot of people achieving some degree of individuation, of being able to accept their own shadow, withdraw projections from it, something in one of these books I read, Jung suggested that you would probably need at least 40% or so of the population to do this, to make a major change in the society.
That's
Well,
a lot of people.
It seems to me that if you are depending on personal transformation to achieve some degree of social equity or social tranquility, it's a pretty remote hope. And it reminds me of my mother. You know, when I was becoming a budding socialist in my 20s, and my mother was a fundamentalist Christian, she said, "Bob, all that social reform that you're talking about is fine, but it will never happen until people get saved." And, and in a way, I hear Jung saying the same thing. That it is individual transformation, and he seems very skeptical about big programs of social reform. So, where are we?
His was a very different time in terms of equality and self-respect. People in America and in Europe, except, for the obvious
And
things.
the population of the earth has doubled since then.
So, I forgot, I got you off your point.
No, that's fine.
But how to remember, however, that earlier juncture of history you're talking about, or were we talking about a juncture of history? What are we talking about? There wasn't, for many sectors of the population, life was pretty miserable all along.
Yeah.
It's not just newly miserable.
Life's
It's
been
always
miserable
been
forever.
miserable.
Forever.
But we weren't so aware of the upper echelons. We didn't learn about what a good life so many other people were having. So
We didn't learn about what a bad life so many other people were having either.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct.
Right.
And we didn't have ads from Temu saying, shop like a billionaire.
No, and the big thing also that changed is, coming back, this is, we didn't talk about that this evening, but the concept of hyper reality, the reality that is made of sign. I'm hinting at Baudrillard, that basically, or the world we live in, the lens we have to look at the world are impairing us because we do not see reality anymore. We see reality less and less because everything that we do, everything that we exchange is not tangible. It's sign of something that has been commoditized. And of course, yes, social media is an example of that, but not only. And the difference between the have and the have not, the people that are in need and the people that have a lot, is exacerbated by the fact that everything look like everybody can have a lot. If you look at, and I simplify, the profiles or people show themselves on social media, everything is following a script. Everything is following what success is meant to look like. So there is like this very intense beaming of the dream, but the reality has never been so far away from that. And that creates this a polarity that is untenable for many.
Successful identity with nobody behind it.
Oh, yeah, this reminds me of a book I read a long time ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? And, so the notion of identity was kind of co-opted. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what happened in Kansas, basically, and the author is picking on Kansas because he was from Kansas. He grew up in Kansas as a kid, and it was very liberal when he was there, and he went away and, moved to the big city and then went back to Kansas as an adult, and everything was changed. And now it was very conservative, and he saw people voting against their own interests. And he was like, what the hell happened? Why are these people voting aligned with why are the middle of the road and lower, the not rich people, voting to support the policies of the rich. And the owner class as opposed to the working class. And what he came to realize was that they had been conned essentially into the American dream, which is, well, you have the potential to be one of those rich people.
Mm-hmm.
So don't you want to, ensure lower taxes for you for when you actually get to be one of those rich people? But what they didn't realize is that in doing so, they were setting up the structure of the system so that they would never get there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, and so it was like they were co-opting their identity to be, they were getting these people to be identified with the rich, so they would vote with that voting bloc, even when it was damaging their own.
I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people go with Trump.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
that, they
It's
want to
that.
identify with that kind of success,
Mhm.
or what they see as
Perceive
that
as.
kind of success. I mean, he looks like a mess to me. I wouldn't be him for anything.
Yeah.
And it
And there
seems
is
to me,
also, yes, go ahead, sorry.
please go ahead.
No, very quick, just was thinking there is also the concept of deficient narratives. And one of the deficient narratives structurally is thinking that there is on one side conservatism and on the other side progressivism. The progressive versus the conservative is very deficient, and it's part of the problem. I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
And I think it's because we still think in largely Marxist terms, in terms of economic interests. And I think the Trumps of the world are appealing to people on a different level. They're appealing to them in terms of culture, values, identity. And
Fears, emotions.
Emotions.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's possible to do that because most people in this country are reasonably well off, economically speaking. The really poor are a relatively small majority in any sort of global or universal sense. So that it's possible to appeal to people's identity issues and to make hay politically in that.
Well, it's after 9 o'clock. We usually try to be somewhat observant there. We don't have to stop talking, but Bob, thank you so much. And I'm thinking you should come back and do the history of identity.
Okay, well,
Wouldn't that be
Years of
good?
research.
I mean, we are talking about identity as if we all know what that means.
okay. Well, thank you very
Anyway,
much.
thank you very much,
Pleasure
Bob.
to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
What's up next week? I think it's Earth Has a Soul.
Next week is Earth Has a
Has a
Soul.
Soul,
Yes,
Okay.
yes, indeed. Anyway.
We'll see you all next week.